Let me first thank Reverend Patrick Williams for hosting me and really being a catalyst for bringing this all together. And of course, I want to thank Reverend Curtis Hall for being another major catalyst in bringing this all together, and for him just being a real profound publicist and booster for my project and for getting the word out there to his colleagues and actually establishing further publics and further audiences for the work that I'm going to share with you tonight. I also want to acknowledge the ancestors. We are actually in the exact space in which the Lafargue Clinic resided, and I have to note that looking down upon us over there against the wall is Reverend Shelton Hale Bishop, who was instrumental in founding the Lafargue Clinic and hosting it for its life here at St. Philip's Episcopal Church. And lastly, I just want to thank you for coming out on a Friday night. I know that you probably have many fish to fry, but I just want to say thank you for coming out and being here with me and sharing in this history. So just a quick bit of background on how I came to write this book and where it kind of fits in my larger trajectory, my motion. It started as a dissertation at Brown University in the Department of American Civilization. They've since changed it to American Studies. American Civilization, the title was a kind of holdover from a kind of set of Cold War politics enunciating America's exceptionalism. And so the direction of my department has gone much more towards a form of critical American studies. But one of the places out of which this project emerged was through a set of questions that I had about the very framework of the normal and the abnormal, the normal and the pathological. And more than just those concepts, but how everyday people live and encounter an idea of normality or pathology in the very institutions of everyday life. So we might walk through schools, we might encounter social workers, we might end up attending a mental health clinic, you might be incarcerated. There is a set of discourses about what constitutes normality and what constitutes pathology or abnormality. And so my entry point into those questions of the normal and the abnormal is historical. It is historiography in the way that that Reverend Hall gestured towards. And lastly, its point of origin for me in telling and digging deep into the archives of the history of the Lafargue Clinic came through an accident. And this is where I tell all my students to read footnotes and read the fine print. I was teaching, just really, if you bear with me, I was slated to teach a course in African American autobiography in the spring semester while I was a graduate student. And it got pushed up a month before the start of the fall semester. They said, you got to teach this now. And I said, wow, okay, so I got to do my homework, right? So I of course, one of the masterful texts in the tradition of African American autobiography is the great work, Black Boy, American Hunger by Richard Wright. And in doing my homework on Richard Wright, in a chronology of his life, there is listed under 1946, co-founds the Lafargue Mental Hygiene Clinic in Harlem, New York. Light bulbs go off, and I still have the book, I still have the chronology, and I still have it, it says, look that up. And so I looked that up. And I followed the pathway to our neighbor, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I followed that path to Yale's Beinecke Library, where the Richard Wright papers are, and I followed that path down to the Library of Congress, where the Dr. Frederick Wortham papers are now open. So what I want to do tonight is share some, what I see as some of the most evocative passages in my book. I'm going to read aloud to you, and we have a little bit of show and tell, kind of some images to correspond with the narrative that I'm going to share. And then, so I'm going to do that for approximately a half hour, maybe a touch, give or take. And then we're going to open it up for a dialogue and questions and answers that you may have, both in terms of the process as well as the end result and substance of my book, Under the Strain of Color. So without further ado, I want to share some actual narrative. This portion comes from chapter 3, which is titled Between the Sewer and the Church. Between the Sewer and the Church, the emergence of the Lafargue Mental Hygiene Clinic. And just a quick note, the title Between the Sewer and the Church came from the notes that Ralph Ellison, the great novelist Ralph Ellison, had taken in preparation for an article that he would write, which was later published as Harlem is Nowhere. But if you think about, we are literally between the sewer and the church. And that's what he was saying, a statement about the positionality of, the positioning is a better word, of this, what he called an underground extension of democracy, the actual space that you and I are in right now. Living in the rectory of the St. Philip's Episcopal Church during the Great Depression, Elizabeth Bishop could occasionally hear her father, Reverend Shelton Hale Bishop, the church's pastor, as he counseled his parishioners in a nearby room. Can you go to the next slide? While he primarily offered advice for newly married couples or those facing domestic difficulties, Elizabeth saw that he sometimes left his office knowing his pastoral counseling was insufficient. Reverend Bishop told his family that some of those whom he counseled were in real need of professional psychiatric care. He was often exasperated that there was no suitable place to refer Black New Yorkers for psychotherapy. One of the oldest Black congregations in New York, at West 134th Street and 7th Avenue, St. Philip's sits at the intersection, I should change that in the next edition. St. Philip's sits at the intersection of Upper Manhattan, that the U.S. Census defined as the Central Harlem District. Harlem Hospital, just a few blocks away, would have no outpatient psychiatric clinic until 1947, and no Department of Psychiatry until 1962. When Bishop suggested going to Harlem Hospital for emergency treatment, his parishioners usually rejected the idea. Quote, "I'm not going there. They'll strap me down on a gurney and have the police take me to Bellevue. And if I go there, they'll send me along to Manhattan State Hospital, where I'll never be heard from again." Just a quick footnote, that comes verbatim from an oral history I did with Reverend Bishop's daughter, Dr. Elizabeth Bishop Davis Trussell, which I am going to actually give the sound recordings to the church, so you'll have it here for an archive. So when, in the winter of 1946, a young Ralph Ellison asked Reverend Bishop if he would be interested in meeting with a group of men and women who wanted to open a walk-in mental health clinic for the people of Harlem, Bishop immediately embraced the idea. Bishop had been trying for years to to persuade the New York Department of Hospitals to establish a mental health center for the Black community of Harlem. Appointed pastor of St. Philip's in 1933, he quickly became one of the Black community's most vocal advocates for civil rights and economic opportunity. He was active in progressive politics and social movements in the 1920s and 30s, including working with the Socialist Party on the presidential campaigns of Norman Thomas. And he participated in the founding of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, an ecumenical precursor to the Congress of Racial Equality. Anybody who's done any study or history of the civil rights movement knows how important CORE was, Congress of Racial Equality. In the late 1920s, Bishop established a Department of Social Welfare within St. Philip's, which became increasingly vital during the Great Depression, supplementing any relief benefits African Americans in Harlem may have received from the city of New York. And under his leadership, St. Philip's membership had grown, attracting not only the traditional upper crust of Black Harlem's Episcopalian elite, but many of the West Indian and Southern-born migrants who streamed into Harlem during the 1940s. St. Philip's was Bishop's base of activism. From St. Philip's, he looked outward to the whole of the Harlem community and was keenly aware of the difficulties finding adequate housing and employment, especially for new migrants. But he also had a larger vision of the health of Black Harlem, its emotional and psychological well-being. When Bishop once requested that the city establish a fully staffed, fully funded mental hygiene clinic, officials in the Department of Hospitals pointed to Bellevue or claimed that Black people only needed life's basics. Negroes don't need psychiatry, they simply need bread, Bishop was told. One evening in March 1946, Reverend Bishop led a group of visitors down to the basement in the St. Philip's Parish House. Richard Wright, can you click the next?